Again. It's always nice when you get close to a 4th of July weekend and it's rainy. Everybody shows up to church on Sunday, so that's a great thing. If you're joining us for the first time this morning, I'm not Pastor Lincoln. I'm Brian, just to make that clear. Pastor Lincoln and his family are on a well-deserved vacation right now. So if you're just visiting us again for the first time, or if you've been here long-term, you need to know we have a tradition here every summer that when Lincoln goes on vacation, I take a Sunday and talk about the Seattle Mariners. So sadly, I did promise Pastor Lincoln that this year I would not do that. So Midge, if you're out there, I'm sorry, we're not going to talk about the Mariners. We're not going to talk about their 53 and 31 record. We're not going to talk about Edwin Diaz's 31 saves. And we're certainly not going to talk about James Paxton's no-hitter. No, instead I was thinking, what do we want to talk about today? And I thought, okay, this sounds like a lot of fun, especially in the summer. Let's talk about some classic literary fiction. Sound like fun? Yeah, I hear the crickets, I get it. So how many of you were ever had the privilege of reading Moby Dick? Wow. I'm impressed. How about this one? Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Okay, still a couple. Hind's Feet on Hind's Places. Great. Okay, now this one I know, Bezod, I know you've watched this, you've seen this one. This is my favorite. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by VeggieTales. Okay. Wow, almost everybody in here. Okay. Well, the question I have is, what do all of these fine works of literature have to do with each other? What do they have in common? Well, each one of these is a work of fiction that actually points to a much deeper theological meaning than what's on the surface. Each of them uses the fictional story and the characters in them as an allegory to bring out some deep, deep theological truth. So today, we're going to study a work of nonfiction. We're going to study the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 9 and 10, which is a true historical, factual story that God uses as an allegory to give us a closer look at him. So we're in the midst of our series called The Do-Over King, studying the life of David. So beginning in 2 Samuel, chapters 9 and 10, God reaches into the events in David's life to specifically give us a glimpse of his character and then of our own. So let's set the stage here. Over the last few chapters, the last few weeks, we've gone through what's going on with the life of David. And the first thing I want to note is the Ark of the Covenant has now been moved to Jerusalem, where it belongs. And David has expanded the territory of Israel to fulfill all the areas that God had told the Israelites when they first entered the land that they were to conquer. And so God's promises for the kingdom of Israel have now finally been realized. God has secured the throne of David from all of his enemies, both internal and external. In fact, last week, Mo was with us. He worked us through what's called the Davidic covenant. It's God's promise and his guarantee to David that his kingdom would reign forever and be established with his offspring for all eternity. It's the precursor to the eventual coming of Messiah, our King. So at this point in his life, David has so far fulfilled all that God has asked of him. And God has fulfilled all that he had promised to David and for Israel. So now, David can take a rest. Finally, he's able to focus on being a king rather than being a warrior. See, if you remember, God had once called David a man after his own heart. And so in these two chapters, we get to see the heart of David. And through it, we also get to see the heart of God. So are you ready with me? Okay, chapter 9, starting at verse 1. Let's go through the text here with me. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in his feet. And the king said to him, where is he? Ziba said to the king, he's in the house of Mashir, the son of Amiel at Lodabar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Mashir, the son of Amiel at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, behold, I'm your servant. David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul, your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage, and he said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? So let's camp on this section for a minute. What exactly is David doing here? Why is he reaching out to Mephibosheth? Well, several things going on that we want to focus on. First, David is fulfilling a promise he made to Jonathan years before, Mephibosheth's father. Jonathan, the son of King Saul, who had supported and loved David, even though it meant Jonathan would never be king. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, David promised Jonathan that he would always show favor to his descendants, even after he would become king. And this is a picture for us how God always works, isn't it? See, last week Mo was with us. He shared how we can always trust on God's promises. God always remembers his promises, and he always keeps his promises, unlike mankind, who often forgets, often breaks, often disregards promises. But here, how does David do? David remembers and he keeps his covenant. He honors a promise he made to Mephibosheth's father years before. Now, what does David owe Mephibosheth? Nothing. Who would know if David didn't keep his promise? No one. What did Mephibosheth do to deserve David's favor? Nada. David keeps the promise made long ago anyway because it's part of his character, and it's an example of the character of God. Now, what was it David asked of Ziba, Saul's former servant? Is there not still someone of the house of Israel, house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, there's still a son of Jonathan, he's crippled in his feet, that I may show kindness of God to him. What is David's intent? His intent is to show mercy and kindness to Mephibosheth, even though he is part of the family of what could be David's enemies. And this is just like what God offers us. Ziba tells David about Mephibosheth and that he's crippled in his feet. Well, this also is significant. Why? Well, Ziba reveals this to assure David that Mephibosheth is no threat. See, Mephibosheth is in that line who could have been king after Jonathan. And Ziba, his servant, wants to protect him from David because he could be seen to be a threat. See, in the ancient Near East, and even today in a lot of regions, as many places in the world, when a new king or a new political system is established, what happens? The old lineage is removed, and removed permanently, so to speak. So while David's intentions are loving and gracious, and he's reaching out, Ziba feels the need to protect Mephibosheth from possibly being terminated by David. So what do we know here? What do we know about Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth was only 5 when his father Jonathan was killed. Now he's grown and he has a son of his own. And he likely has no knowledge of David and Jonathan's love that they had for each other, or the covenant that was between them. He only knows that what? His father has been killed, his grandfather is overthrown, and his family line has been removed from the possibility of the throne. Something else he knows here is that 7 members of King Saul's household had been hanged. And frankly, Mephibosheth kind of wants to stay alive. Can't blame him. One final thing that he knows is that David, as king of all Israel, and as the fact that he was an enemy of King Saul, David has the power and authority to do anything that he wishes to Mephibosheth. And so he lives in fear of David the king. And so while Mephibosheth is hiding from David, this king who could easily destroy him, but David is instead reaching out to him, and he's offering him grace and compassion. It's a great picture of what God does for each one of us, isn't it? I mean, while we try and run from God, knowing that we really deserve condemnation, God longingly and lovingly reaches out to each one of us. So how does Mephibosheth approach David when he's brought before David's throne, knowing that David is a king who holds his very life in his hands? How does he deal with this? Well, starting at verse 6. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold, I'm your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of Saul, your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Fell at his feet, paid homage, and then asks, What is your servant that I should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Dead dog such as I? Mephibosheth here assumes that he is worthless in the eyes of the king. He assumes that he has no value at all to King David. So how did he approach the king? He approached him with humility. He approached him humbly. He approached the king on the king's terms. He approached wisely. So how did the king treat him as a result? Well, first, he assures Mephibosheth that you have nothing to fear. David doesn't want to do anything bad to him. In fact, he only wants to care and provide what's best for Mephibosheth. Try and say that 8 times in a row. Mephibosheth. Then he restores all the lands that Mephibosheth had lost at the overthrow of his grandfather, King Saul. See, all that Mephibosheth has lost, David restores. And best of all, now he gives Mephibosheth the highest possible honor. From now on, he will dine at the king's table. And this means a lot more than just good food. Nothing wrong with good food. But this means so much more. It's a place of honor. It's a place of prestige. It's a place of significance. David is treating Mephibosheth as if he were one of his own sons. And technically, see, Mephibosheth shouldn't even be allowed to be in David's presence. He's crippled in both feet. See, infirmities and deformities and weaknesses at that time in that culture disqualified someone from being with the king. Mephibosheth has nothing of value to offer David. In his own eyes, he's a dead dog with no value whatsoever. But how does David treat him? The king places tremendous value on him. David, in his love and his compassion, treats him as if he were one of his own sons, giving him the place of honor. He values Mephibosheth. So, can you see the allegory here? Do you see where we're going? It's the same with God and us. We have nothing to really offer God, and yet with all of our infirmities, our sins, our weaknesses, He loves us. He puts tremendous value on each and every one of us. God chooses to ignore all of our mess, and in His grace and mercy, He seeks us out and offers to adopt us as His sons. In fact, when you go home today, look up this passage in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5. But it's up to us whether we choose to accept that offer. Mephibosheth, he chose wisely. He accepted the king's invitation on the king's terms and was rewarded with life, the restoration of all of his resources, the assurance of his security, and a place at the king's table as an adopted son. Jesus is offering us the same. How are we going to choose? So chapter 9, it's the story of a gracious king and a grateful servant. It's an allegory of what Jesus offers each one of us if we choose wisely. But now we're going to move into chapter 10. We're going to see something just a little bit different. We're going to see a different way of approaching the king. Here in this chapter, we're introduced to Hanun. Hanun is the new ruler of the Ammonites who's replaced his father. See, ironically now, in Hebrew, Hanun's name can mean one of two things. It can mean to show favor, or it can also mean to be loathsome. So let's see how this plays out. Starting at verse 1, after this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun, his son, reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he's honoring your father? Hasn't David sent his servants to you to search the city, to spy it out, and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants, and he shaved off half of the beard of each. And he cut off their garments in the middle at their hips, and he sent them away. And when it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. So how does David respond? Well, the first thing David does is he reaches out to his own emissaries, his ambassadors, and says, stay where you are, don't worry, wait until your beards grow back, then come back to Jerusalem. Basically, we can handle things without you. We don't want you to be ashamed when you come to Jerusalem. So he is compassionately caring for his own people. But now, getting back to David and Hanun, with the best of intentions, David was graciously reaching out to Hanun in a gesture of goodwill and kindness. Now note, here in the text where it says, I will deal loyally, if you have an NIV, an NASB, a King James, it all uses a little more accurate rendering, which is, I will show kindness or I will show favor. It's actually a play on Hanun's name. David will show kindness or favor to Hanun. And we don't have the history, we don't have a historical record of the relationship or what had happened between David and Nahash. But somewhere along the line, Nahash had shown great kindness and favor to David, probably while he was running from Saul. And so David sends his personal emissaries to Hanun to show kindness, console him at the loss of his father. It's David's friend. Now, starting at verse 3 again. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he's honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city, to spy it out and overthrow it? Let's take a break here for a second. Was that David's intent? Was he really sending these people to spy out the land? Of course not. And so there's a warning for us here that I don't want us to miss. See, we all need to be wise about the people that we surround ourselves with, those who we take counsel from, those whose advice we heed. Think for a moment, how many of these Hanun's advisors are there in your life? I'm guessing each one of us knows a person or persons, or maybe a whole slew of people who always assume the worst of people in every situation. You know, that someone whose insecurities or inferiority complex makes it impossible for them to see goodness in others. It's that person who always ascribes bad motives to people who are actually trying to help. The one who always tells you don't trust them. It's that paranoid person who thinks everyone is out to destroy them or to make them look bad. So do you have these people in your life? be really, really cautious. Let's each of us be very cautious of heeding this kind of bad advice. Let's not miss out on the blessings that God has for us because we're heeding the advice of someone who is cynical and sees the worst in everybody. We need to be following the voice of God. Hanun was not as wise. Okay, back to our text. So what does Hanun do with this counselor's advice? Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half the beard of each, cut off their garments in the middle at their hips, and sent them away. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, "Remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return." It wasn't enough for Hanun to simply turn away David's gesture of kindness, to simply send his emissaries back home. That wasn't enough. Instead, in a show of arrogance and pride, he humiliates each of them in the most embarrassing way possible. See, in Near East countries, shaving off one's beard as an adult was an insult to one's manhood. It's an ultimate insult. But to make that worse, he cuts off their clothes to expose parts that shouldn't be exposed in public. That's the ultimate humility and shame. And to do this to David's ambassadors, that was to do it to David, the king. Hanun was repaying King David's kindness by spitting in his face. It was tantamount to declaring war. So, what do we see? How did Hanun choose to approach the king? He chose arrogance, pride, rebellion. Hanun chose poorly. And what's more, Hanun suddenly realizes, okay, maybe I've made a mistake. I could be in serious trouble with someone of great power. My weakness is kind of exposed here. So how does he choose to fix this problem? Does he repent? Does he go to David and try and reconcile? Does he apologize? Let's read on. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians of Beth-Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. What does Hanun do? He doubles down. Instead of admitting that he's in the wrong, instead of admitting that he's in a place of weakness and backing down against a king who has shown him grace, instead of asking forgiveness from a king who he had wronged and a king who is infinitely more powerful than him, Hanun chooses to escalate. He doubles down and he throws the gauntlet down at David's feet. In fact, it wasn't until this point that David even prepared for war. Worse, he sucks others in to join him in this ill-fated venture of rebellion. So are we surprised? Well, we shouldn't be surprised. Rebellion and arrogance always cause delusion. Catch that? Rebellion and arrogance always cause delusion. And see, Hanun has become deluded in that he can actually defeat David. See, while this story is a historically factual event, it's also an allegory of how humanity treats that loving God who's continually reaching out to us. It's the history of man's rebellion and hatred toward God, and it's a precursor of things to come. We see it in the parable of the vineyard tenants who killed the vineyard's son. And we see it in the historical and the continual rebellion of Israel against God that Jesus so painfully spoke of in Luke 13. Jesus said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. How often I would have gathered you." And then worst of all, we also see it now in the future, in the final, ultimate act of defiance in Revelation 19, where the hatred of God is so strong that all the armies of the world who are fighting each other actually gather together to join forces to fight against the returning Christ at the Battle of Armageddon. We should not be surprised. Rejection of God's grace, of his loving mercy, always results in disbelief. And disbelief always results in what? In anger, hatred, and rebellion toward God himself. In a society that is increasingly moving toward atheism and a disbelief in God, and showing an animosity toward all things Christian, we shouldn't be surprised. See, in his book, The Making of an Atheist, Dr. James Spiegel is a famous professor of philosophy and religion at Taylor University. In fact, he's a former atheist himself. He makes this assessment. He says this: the rejection of God is a matter of will, not of intellect. Atheism is not the result of an objective assessment of the evidence, but of a stubborn disobedience. It does not arise from the careful application of reason, but from willful rebellion. Atheism is the suppression of truth by wickedness, the cognitive consequence of immorality. Hanun chose poorly. And like his name implies, he becomes loathsome to David. He rejected the grace offered to him by the king and instead rebelled in arrogance and hatred. Hanun became an allegory for every person who rejects the grace and mercy of Christ. Of course, what was the predictable result of this choice? Verse 7, when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. The Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. The Syrians of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. And then in verse 18, the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobach, the commander of the army, so that he died there. When all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. So not only were Hanun's Ammonites defeated, so were the Syrians who foolishly came along to fight alongside them. Now, had Hanun accepted David's graciousness, where would he have been? His father had been a friend to David, and David wished to be friends with Hanun. He wanted a relationship. The Ammonites could have been allies of David's kingdom, the kingdom that was blessed and honored by God. They could have been a part of the blessings that God was showering on David and Israel. But rather, Hanun listened to his advisors and showed the results. Rebellion and arrogance always causes delusion. Hanun thought he had a better idea. He rejected the king who was offering kindness. He humiliated the king's men. He declared war on God's king, dragging others along with him to their destruction. This allegory serves as a warning to everyone. You see, when we reject God, when we ignore his ongoing requests for a reconciled relationship, and we thumb our nose at his absolute power and authority, there will come a time when he will finally act against that rebellion. So, hang with me here just a little bit longer. Through the life of David, in these 2 chapters, gives us a picture, a short picture of God's character. Okay. First, he's a loving God who longs to have a relationship with us. A relationship where we honor him and he mercifully cares and provides for us with blessings and honor too great for us to even imagine. It's a relationship where he offers us grace, forgiveness for our sins, and covers our blemishes and infirmities, just like Mephibosheth. And he's also a merciful God, one who is patient and long-suffering in the face of those who rebel against him. He is slow to anger. But finally, he's also a wrathful God, one who eventually will pour out his wrath on those who ultimately refuse to accept his grace, his mercy, and his forgiveness. And he offers this choice to each one of us. And that brings us to our key verse for today. 2 Samuel 9, verse 7. It says this, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." You see, when we choose to follow Jesus, he restores all things to us, just like David restored to Mephibosheth. He invites us to sit at his table, the table of the king. And though we can offer him nothing, though we're blemished and unworthy, he chooses us to join his banquet feast. He treats us as adopted sons. When we choose to follow Jesus, we have an unfettered access to the God of the universe. Hebrews 4:16 said this to each one of us as believers, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." This is what Jesus offers us. It's our choice. See, each of us will have to choose how we approach the king that's reaching out to us, our God, the God of the universe. We can approach Jesus like Mephibosheth. We come with humility, knowing we have nothing of value to offer, but we can accept his grace. Or we can approach him like Hanun, with contempt, violence, and derision, and suffer the consequences of God's wrath. Now, I'm sure there are some here today that may be struggling with disbelief. And you may have heard this question. I'm hearing it a lot in the marketplace, out in the community a lot. It's very popular in our culture. It's people who are questioning whether there's a God and questioning if he's loving. You may have heard it. It goes like this: why would a loving God send anyone to hell? Anybody heard that question? Why would a loving God send anyone to hell? Guess what? It's the wrong question. The question is not, why would a loving God send anyone to hell? The question is, why would anyone choose hell over a loving God? See, the choice is each of ours. God is reaching out to us. Jesus has lovingly offered salvation to every one of us. It's up to us whether we accept it or we reject him. Our loving God doesn't choose to send somebody to hell. But many, sadly, will choose hell for themselves over a loving God. So I want you to think about that today as we close in prayer. Let's each of us choose wisely. Amen.